Hello and welcome to MIJ Tech. My name is Mike, and welcome to the first in a series of videos which will be highlighting my AMD Ryzen 5 1600 computer build. This is a significant time for me building this computer, since the last time I built for myself a computer from scratch was in January of 2003. And you probably don't need me to tell you that a lot has changed since 2003. It was before the dawn of consumer-grade multi-core CPUs. RAM was still often measured in megabytes. GPUs were still being made by a company called ATI, which was later absorbed by AMD, and that year DirectX 9 graphics cards were just beginning to gain traction. It was also before the time of solid-state drives as we know them today, and also before the time of the 80+ rating system, which is given to power supplies. And back in those days when you built computers, you often put those power supplies on the tops of your tower cases as opposed to the bottom. It was also before the times of fads like windowed cases, RGB, and it was a time when LCD monitors were just beginning to take over CRT monitors in the marketplace. Need I say more? I've chosen to break up this video series into 4 different parts, looking at component selection, the build process, Windows installation, and the device setup. In this video, we'll be looking at the component selection, and I'll be giving you a little bit of an explanation as to why some of these parts were chosen. As we get into this discussion, I'd like to first offer this disclaimer, that the majority of these parts were purchased Black Friday of 2018, and that if I were to build a computer today in 2020, I'd probably make some different decisions. So keep that in mind as we go through this list of parts. Looking at the base components, let's first take a look at the CPU that I purchased, the star of this computer build, the AMD Ryzen 5 1600, a 6-core 12-thread processor with a 3.2 GHz base clock and a 3.6 GHz boost clock. I'd like to emphasize at this point that I'm not that much of a gamer, and that while this processor is sufficient for running modern games, that's not the reason that I purchased it. And for anyone that wants to get into gaming, there are better processors that one could purchase. This processor runs on the AM4 socket, and therein lies much of the reason that I purchased this processor. In 2017, when AMD first started releasing processors on the AM4 socket, they pledged to continue releasing new products on the AM4 socket through the year 2020, and sure enough, Q4 of this year, AMD is planning to release their 4th generation of Ryzen processors on the AM4 socket. This kind of an upgrade path intrigued me, and so I was willing to put AMD to the test. When I purchased this processor, I just missed out on a deal for a Ryzen 7 1700X for $150. So instead I purchased this Ryzen 5 1600 for $130, which was a reasonable option at the time. I could have also purchased a Ryzen 5 2600 for $145, and while it is a better performing processor, I was stubborn and decided that I wasn't going to pay almost as much for a 6-core 12-thread processor as I could have paid for an 8-core 16-thread processor, and so I purchased the Ryzen 5 1600. Having done that, it will make a future upgrade that much more dramatic, and while that's not the best reason to purchase a lesser processor, this processor should be one that is still able to perform the tasks that I have for it. The motherboard I purchased was the ASRock X470 Master SLI AC. And for those who are familiar with AMD's chipset naming, you'll recognize that this was AMD's flagship 2nd generation Ryzen chipset. Probably the closest I'll ever be to bleeding edge technology. But anyhow, one of the distinguishing features of this chipset is also mentioned in the product name, and that's NVIDIA's SLI, which, for those who are not aware, is a technology which allows a user to be able to combine multiple GPUs in order to improve their gaming performance. Now again, I'm not that much of a gamer, but as a hobbyist I do like to explore and play around with some of these technologies. The motherboard that I purchased went along with my overall plan to test out AMD's promise of their AM4 socket support. And one of the motherboard features often mentioned in association with this is the quality of a motherboard's voltage regulation, which I discovered after the fact was somewhat lacking on the board that I purchased. It was advertised on the site that I bought it from as having 12-phase voltage regulation, which would have been great had it not actually been misleading. And so I purchased this board for $100 after mail-in rebates over other options I considered at the time, like the ASRock Tai Chi, which was also on sale at the time for $160, but offers much better voltage regulation and would have been better suited to upgrading to one of the 12 or 16 core processors that I'd consider upgrading it to in the future. Now, that's not to say it doesn't work well with the processor that I originally purchased it with, but it does mean that I may run into some difficulties if I choose to upgrade to one of these other future generation processors in the future. The memory I ended up purchasing was a 16GB kit of Gale Tough Gaming DDR4 running at 3000 MHz. I went with 16GB because that's how much reviewers said at the time would be sufficient for a new computer build. Now, if I were purchasing parts for a new computer build today, I'd be tempted to go with 32GB, mostly because of how much prices have come down even since then. And I definitely wasn't going to go with 8GB because that's how much the system had that I was coming from, and I wanted it to feel like more of an upgrade. I went with a 3000 MHz kit primarily because of the processor that I chose. The memory controller on first generation Ryzen chips was not generally known to be that stable above that speed, and lower speed kits were about the same price, so I felt like getting the 3000 MHz kit was a solid option overall. Again, if I were purchasing parts for a new computer build today and get, say, a third generation Ryzen chip, I might get a 3600 MHz kit instead, although the price premium you would pay for that might not necessarily justify the small performance increase you would get over a 3000 MHz kit, but with that your mileage may vary. And I went with the Gale Tough Gaming kit itself because that just happened to be the cheapest kit of that speed available at the time to me, and I had been looking at a Corsair Vengeance kit for $99, but as is my pattern, I missed out on the special, and so I ended up purchasing the Gale kit for $105 instead. But it has RGB, so that makes everything better, right? While I had considered purchasing an aftermarket heatsink and fan, I decided instead to stick with the AMD Wraithspire cooler included with my CPU. One of the other options I'd considered in order to go along with the silent theme for my build was the Be Quiet Dark Rock Pro 4, but once again this is a time when I missed out on a special. The Dark Rock Pro 4 is objectively better in performance than the AMD Wraithspire cooler, but one of its downsides, aside from the price, is the fact that I've heard that the installation for it is absolutely a nightmare, which makes me kind of glad that I didn't go ahead and purchase it at the time. I have found for now that the AMD Wraithspire is good enough in terms of its noise output, and I've even heard from some reviewers that it's capable of supporting a mild overclock on the chip that I purchased, and that's something that I'll probably explore in the future. And that's where I'll end it for now. I am hoping to try to keep the length of these videos down as much as possible, both for your sake and for mine, so I can release them more quickly. I do plan to have 2 more videos finishing up this part of my Ryzen 5 1600 computer build series. Like this video if you found any of this information helpful, dislike this video if you think I'm just a hopeless AMD fanboy. Subscribe to my channel using the red button down below if you haven't already, and click the bell icon to be notified of all future updates to this series as well as other related content. Feel free to leave a comment critiquing any part of my build or sharing your experiences about recent computer builds, as well as any other comments related to selecting parts for a computer build. My name is Mike. This is MIJ Tech. Thank you for watching. Hey, I got through an entire video without mentioning my video quality. Oh, so much for that.